All right, y'all. Welcome back to the show. It's Anti-War Radio. Our next guest is Phil Giraldi, former CIA and DIA counterterrorism officer and contributing editor at the American Conservative magazine, contributing writer, or regular contributor or something, antiwar.com, of course, original.antiwar.com/Giraldi, and he's the executive editor of the Council for the National Interest Foundation. Welcome back to the show, Phil.
Hi, Scott.
Appreciate you joining us today. So, Foreign Policy Magazine online came out with this article about Jundallah, well, I'll let you go ahead and describe them, I guess, this terrorist group operating inside Iran. And the story is that perhaps we were wrong. We thought the CIA was backing these guys all this time, but really it was Mossad pretending to be CIA, and we all had bad information or something. What's going on here?
Well, I think it's kind of like peeling an onion. You know, there are layers to this that it depends. I've been looking very carefully at some of the comments coming out from the government on what has been going on. They haven't really been very forthcoming, I must admit. But Hillary keeps declaring, generically speaking, we haven't been involved with assassinating Iranian scientists. We haven't been involved with this, that, and the other thing. Well, the fact is, you know, we are involved, but the question is who's pulling the trigger in some of these cases. In this case, the Jundallah, which there has been a lot of evidence, has been supported both by the Pakistanis and the U.S. It now appears that they were, in some cases at least, being directed by Israeli case officers using U.S. passports and pretending to be CIA. Nobody's denied the report, and apparently it's quite true. I had a piece in the American Conservative magazine back in September 2010, which reported that Israeli intelligence officers in the U.S. were approaching U.S. citizens, Arab Americans, and were obtaining their cooperation by pretending to be FBI or pretending to be CIA. So, you know, these accounts have been out there for a while.
Well, but that's still running Jundallah inside Iran in the name of the U.S. or NATO, I guess, as they claim. But now, Seymour Hersh, I guess, you know, Gareth was on the show yesterday, Gareth Porter, from IPS News, and he said that, yeah, you know, this all sounded plausible to him. But I guess he seemed to think that the origin of the story, that it was the CIA that was backing Jundallah and not the Israelis, was simply the lies of the Israelis, and that Jundallah went bragging that they were sponsored by the CIA, and that was the word that got back to Seymour Hersh and Andrew Coburn and to you, because you've been reporting that America's CIA has been backing them for a couple of years anyway, right? Or not?
Well, I don't know. I mean, my sources basically were that Jundallah was carrying out these operations, and they were being supported by the United States government. Now, I think even at the time, as I think back, a lot of the assumption was that they were really being run by somebody else, like the Pakistanis, or Mossad really didn't come up because it would have seemed to be fairly far-fetched for Mossad officers to be able to operate in that part of the world. So but I think the consensus has to be here that Jundallah has been supported by somebody. And basically, they've been carrying out terror operations inside Iran. Obviously, there are a number of possible players who have an interest in doing that.
So, is it the consensus then that Jundallah are the guys driving up on motorcycles and bombing Iranian scientists?
No, I don't think so. I think that's another story. I think that's people that have been recruited by either CIA or Mossad and been trained and sent back into Iran. I believe they're Iranians or Persians, otherwise they would have trouble operating inside Iran. And I suspect they were recruited out of MEC, which is why we're seeing so much stuff in support of MEC coming out of various politicians and other interest groups, because MEC is kind of their boys. They're cutting edge in terms of getting inside Iran and carrying out these kind of operations. It's funny, but having been an experienced CIA case officer, I understand how this stuff works a lot better than somebody in a newspaper. And the fact is that a guy like me or a Mossad officer doesn't have the ability to go inside Iran and carry out an operation. So you've got to acquire somebody else who can do it for you. And in this case, there are some obvious candidates. Mech would be, I think, the most prominent. It's probably slightly less possible that it could be some Kurdish groups. But the same kind of dynamic, people who speak the local language, who more or less can fit in.
I guess they're, according to this article, Bush was really mad about this. He went absolutely ballistic that the Israelis were posing as Americans and recruiting these, as Bush would have called them, Al-Qaeda-tied terrorists against Iran under his nose without his authority.
Yeah, that's what the article. That's what the article says, and Mark Perry is the author of the article, and he is he's a meticulous researcher and a checker of facts. So I have to believe that that's correct, and that means that the story about Israel being involved with Jundallah using the fake documents has been around for a while. It just hasn't surfaced.
And then, so would you agree with Garrett that the purpose of this is just to marginalize the moderates and make any type of reasonable negotiation impossible?
I don't know. I think it's more complicated than that. I think the idea of I did a piece for anti-war on secret wars back about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I think.
Right, about the 2 new findings.
Yeah, and the findings. And I think the idea is, in the case of Iran, in the case of Syria, they want to overthrow the regime. In the case of Iran, they know they're not going to overthrow the regime, and I think it's just a question of setting up a bunch of relationships and employing various covert actions to destabilize, to make the Iranian government waste a lot of resources on dealing with these problems. Mm-hmm. I think that's probably more so what it is.
Yeah, well, John Glazer pointed out in one of his pieces that, yeah, look how completely ineffectual the Iranian FBI is, whatever it is. Their counterintelligence agency is getting pantsed over and over again over there right now.
Well, I don't know how true that is.
Buildings blowing up and scientists dying.
I don't know how true that is. I mean, it's what I hear when I talk to Iranians is that the police state there is pretty effective. So the fact that these operations are being pulled off, it implies that there's a certain level of sophistication. They claim to have caught some people earlier this week, but the report never followed up with any names or identities as far as I can tell. But you can argue on one level that they seem to be somewhat ineffective, but nevertheless, I mean, to carry out an operation like this, and one has to, consider that there's a certain level of sophistication to it. It means that these people were pretty well prepared on the outside and probably sent in, and they had infrastructure with them, but they had to be people that mixed in locally and that were indistinguishable from the local population. Otherwise, it wouldn't work.
Mm-hmm. Now, they say in here, I believe Mark Perry writes that the Iranians were mad because the Pakistani government didn't crack down on Jundallah like they promised they would. Is that just they want to deflect these guys across their western border if they got to deal with them at all, or what's going on there?
Well, I'm not sure what that means, but I have been hearing for years that the Pacs were kind of in bed with us in terms of using Jundallah. So I think that this is kind of maybe on the part of the Iranians a diplomatic way of saying that we know you're involved with this. I'm not sure what that means, to be honest.
Well, now these guys, I guess it shouldn't go without saying or anything, that apparently they do suicide bombings, and they like to kidnap cops and soldiers and kill them, shoot them in the back of the head or cut their heads off, these kinds of things. These are, what we'd have called the worst enemies in the worst days of the Iraq War, of course. Just like them. Zarqawi types.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yep. All right, now hold it right there. We'll be right back, everybody, with Phil Giraldi after this. Original.antiwar.com/Giraldi. All right, y'all, welcome back to the show. It's Anti-War Radio. I'm Scott Horton. I'm talking with Phil Giraldi from the American Conservative at antiwar.com and the Council for the National Interest Foundation. His latest piece is Creating American Terrorists, which I hope we'll have a minute to talk about that in a minute. But the one before that is What War with Iran Might Look Like. And my segue to that is this Wall Street Journal piece about how President Obama himself and the Secretary of Defense have personally called Benjamin Netanyahu and other political and military leaders in Israel and told them to not get us into a war. Is it really like that? They're begging, please don't give our sanctions more time to work at whatever it is they're supposed to do. I don't know.
Well, yeah, I think it is. I think the issue here is that, as I think I've said every time we've discussed this on your show, I don't think Obama wants a war with Iran. I think that's the last thing he wants. But he's under pressure to make it look as if he's willing to do so. And it was interesting just before Christmas, I think, or maybe just after, when Leon Panetta, the Secretary of Defense, said that the red line for the United States with Iran, meaning the point at which we would feel compelled to take military action, was if Iran actually possessed a nuclear weapon. Now that's kind of, walked the dog back a bit, because it used to be that was just a capability was the thing and this was the Israeli line pretty much that we were aping. But now it's clear that, to me anyway, that the administration is trying very hard to avoid this and avoid a war.
Well, that's good, but how worried are they that Netanyahu will really drag them kicking and screaming into a war, Phil, you think?
They must be seriously worried. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing these kinds of things. And you're quite right. They have only limited ability to pressure Israel into doing anything. And so I think they are genuinely worried. I'm doing a piece right now for the American Conservative, which will be out early next week, about how the National Security Agency has been monitoring Israeli military transmissions and has seen a surge in these transmissions, which normally indicates that some kind of military action is impending. But the analysts in Washington are all divided as to who the target is. Is it Lebanon? Is it Gaza? Or is it Iran? Nobody knows.
Yeah. And more frank admissions, echoing really what Netanyahu and Ehud Barak told Jeffrey Goldberg back, I guess, a year and a half ago, that they didn't really fear an Iranian first strike. They just were worried that their ability to act in Lebanon and in Palestine would be limited. And the Israeli army chief has echoed that same thing, as reported by the Associated Press this week. And so it seems like there really is a little bit of a pushback. The Washington Post chose to reprint this one and highlight it. I guess maybe wishful thinking that there's a little bit of pushback from the American establishment about this. Like, hey, we said no, okay? Something like that, maybe?
Yeah, I think there's considerable pushback coming from the Pentagon and from the intelligence agencies. And of course, that the Pentagon canceled a joint exercise with Israel, scheduled for April, I think. And so there's considerable pushback, and people are waking up to the fact that war with Iran would, first of all, not be easy, and secondly, could have very serious negative consequences for the United States. I think people are starting to figure that one out.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's funny because on TV, the way it works, the consensus is, well, something's got to be done about it, and it just sort of goes without saying that this one will be great. Everybody will love this war. It'll be just fine. Don't worry about any negative consequences of it, because they just never come up at all. But then when Ron Paul says, we don't need another war, the way he says it, people go, hey, yeah, I think maybe that guy's right. Yeah. Maybe it didn't work out so well the last time, man. Maybe he's getting through to some.
Yeah, I think that's the point. I think that as somnolent as the American public is on most issues, I think that the evidence is there that what happened in Iraq was not really a good thing for us, and what's happening in Afghanistan is not a good thing. And so the thought of tripling down on a war just in hopes that it'll turn out better against a country that's much bigger, more populous, and much better armed and prepared than either of the previous adversaries is kind of getting through, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, the already kind of pre-coronated Republican front runner Mitt Romney has made Iran his number one issue. That Barack Obama has been so weak on this, when you would think that weakness could have been translated into a willingness to negotiate, but no, he just does everything wrong with all the sanctions and all the threats and still is, criticized as weak. That's like Romney's leading issue, as M.J. Rosenberg is writing this week. That's more important than the economy to Mitt Romney's campaign right now.
Yeah, and the scary thing, of course, is that a lot of Romney's advisors are neocons. So we're going to get the same kind of logic telling us that this is what we should do because we have to do it in terms of our national interest. And certainly nobody in Romney's campaign is going to be challenging that.
All right, now, in this piece at antiwar.com, Phil, you write what war with Iran might look like. And this one gets all the way to a pretty big, uranium fission thing going on there by the end. It doesn't necessarily have to be quite that bad to be pretty bad the way you describe not just, likely, but extremely probable immediate consequences within weeks of a real American and or Israeli war with Iran. Can you take us through some of that?
Well, basically, I hypothesized that a small incident, because the atmosphere is so charged, a small incident could easily escalate into something much bigger. That's the premise of the piece. And it essentially says that, the situation could develop and suddenly things get out of control. I was actually fairly generous in the piece. As it turns out, we had some people commenting on it who pointed out that, in fact, the Iranians have major capabilities in terms of swarming small boats, as they describe it, and also in terms of some missile technologies to sink U.S. warships, not to mention tankers. And so this whole threat of closing the Straits of Hormuz is a very serious one if there were a war, and would probably come about. But then the issue becomes, for me, which I tried to lay out in the article, is once you start a war like this, how do you stop it? And the only option that I can see that the U.S. has, if it started a war with Iran and felt it had gone far enough, would be to say, hey, if you don't stop right now, we're going to nuke you. And at that point, the Iranian response would almost certainly be, the hell with you. And then what would we do? And, of course, once you start that game, the war becomes a lot bigger thing, and you have nuclear-armed Pakistan and India right on the border there. You have numerous other issues. And basically, I could see how something like this could turn out into something like World War III. And it's scary as hell. And it, as you probably noted, the piece when it appeared in Anti-War went kind of crazy. I think we got about 100 comments on it, which is very unusual. And it played all over the internet. So this is something people should be thinking about it. This whole idea of a surgical strike, a contained war, is a lot of nonsense.
Yeah, it's just really the perfect kind of irony. I mean, even really unlike Iraq, I don't think you could quite say this about Iraq, is a situation where they are not the threat they're being portrayed as, that we have to preempt by a million miles. And yet they're just powerful enough to fight back like hell in an asymmetric kind of fashion. They can't really come here. I guess I will ask you to comment on whether, Hamas, cigarette salesmen can, wage attacks here in the United States. But mostly what they can do is screw up the American empire over there. And as you're saying, perhaps even worse. But they could cost all of America's everything in the Gulf, for example, as you describe it in this article.
Yeah, they clearly could. I mean, let's face it. I mean, they do have resources, and as you say, they're asymmetrical. But for example, Hezbollah could inflict serious damage on Israel before being bombed into the Stone Age. But I mean, they could inflict serious damage. And there would certainly be terrorist attacks inside the United States. There would certainly be terrorist attacks throughout the Mideast region and probably all over Europe. So it's, this is serious stuff.
All right, y'all. You heard it, Phil Giraldi. Original.antiwar.com/Giraldi. Check him out at the Council for the National Interest Foundation, where he's the executive director, and also the American Conservative Magazine.com. Thanks, Phil.